Muy buenas noches, mi gente. Gracias por sintonizar a Loisaida TV. Espero que se encuentren bien, saludables, igual que sus familias. Good night, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to our presentation tonight. I hope you are well and safe, and please enjoy this presentation. I would like to present to you my coworker, Dylan Garcia, in conversation with Oscar Cornejo, our invited artist, and want to thank everyone at the Education Department of the Whitney Museum of American Art. Please enjoy. Muchas gracias.
I'm sorry, could everybody hear me? I had myself on mute. Okay. Thank you all for joining us. The Loisaida Center is proud to present this event with the Whitney Museum of American Art. We'd like to thank them for helping us out and putting this together, and we're glad we're able to provide this program for our community at this time. We have a great workshop for you today, but first we'll hear from a presentation from our guest, followed by a workshop. And we'll have a Q&A after that. I'll present Oscar. Oscar Rene Cornejo earned a MFA from Yale School of Art, a BFA from Cooper Union, and was a recipient of the J. William Fulbright Scholarship for Research in El Salvador. In 2004, he co-founded the Latin American Community Art Project, LA Capacidad, where for 7 years he directed the summer artist residencies to promote intercultural awareness through community art education. He is a founding member of Junte, an artist project based in Adjuntas, a town in the mountains of southern Puerto Rico. His work has been included in exhibitions at Radiator Gallery, the Queens Museum, Princeton University, Diverse Works, among other venues. He currently teaches at the Cooper Union. Without further ado, Oscar Rene Cornejo.
Thank you, Dylan, for the intro. And thank you, everyone, for making this happen. A lot of working parts. I figured I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen. And I thought it'd be good to, does everyone see it clearly, full screen? I thought it'd be good to start with just a contextualization of how I approach work. And I start with the first image, which is a shot of my father and mother with my younger sister. And a few years after crossing the border due to Salvadoran conflicts that were happening in the 80s. And I think about the families on the border that have been separated, and thinking about human potential that's being lost because of it. I'm Texas-born Salvadoran who worked summers with my father in construction with no idea of college. It wasn't until high school that an art teacher recognized my artistic potential and pointed me to the Cooper Union School of Art, which initiated my life's paradigm shift. This is an etching, one of my first few etchings that I did when I was a sophomore, I believe, towards the end of my sophomore year. And it was influenced by witnessing the second plane fly into the World Trade Center on 9/11. I reflected on the role we have as artists in society, and research led me to US foreign policy, which led me to the Cold War and Central America's torn social fabric due to civil war. I began utilizing printmaking for personal investigations around the archive, memory, and truth. The last two images you saw were examples of woodcuts. This one in particular, mokuhanga, which is an Eastern form of woodblock printing. Ignorant of the Salvadoran Civil War, I realized those who grew up in El Salvador tried to forget its violence. Trips to Latin America in search of more questions and answers defined who I am today. When I was 21, with the help of peers, I established an art school in the native village my mother left when she herself was 21. I directed cultural development programs within a politically polarized community, subsequently catalyzing my studio practice. It really changed the way I addressed materials. I would work 8 months out of the year to find ways to make the summer residency happen. We would do theater, mural, drawing workshops, tiling, embroidery, whatever was available as far as the visiting artists could teach. As a Salvadoran American, I find myself asking how one can mend a torn social fabric. How does one reconcile the violence and dissonant narrative around collective memory within the community? I reflect on peer histories, family testimony, and our hopes for our culture and society. I'm interested in the nuanced relationships within a Salvadoran diaspora that overcame forced uprootedness and trauma through migration and resilience. I continue to grapple with how we carry and feel our past through physical and emotional labor, and incorporate that as a metaphor to humanize a politicized diaspora. At the Queens Museum, this is a shot of an installation that I created for its Queens International in 2018 called Volumes. I created site-specific installation and satellite works throughout the museum. This installation, called A Night's Embrace, Farewell to Be Greeted, Exposed by Dawn, is a shoji screen grid made of indigo landscape cells anchored by an obsidian chunk wrapped around kumbuk lumber. The screens on an 18-foot pole, metal pole, reference the United States-Mexico border. This piece of lumber itself is harvested when a tree lives its entire cycle. And so I was thinking about mortality. And obsidian creates one of the sharpest edges in the world that can cut you without even knowing. And I thought that was a nice metaphor of transformation of material. Flocked coal and crushed glass mirror the indigo screens as they reflect the lingering effects of scorched earth policies that normalized violence and influenced Salvadoran refugees who responded to Los Angeles gang culture by establishing their own brand of violence. Smoky cloud imagery calls up the Salvadoran military burning enemy assets and points to the ambiguous repercussions of war. The blue chalk lines convey my memories of working with my father in construction in Texas. The materials that create the images speak to the ruptures within the social fabric of El Salvador. In Banderenta, which you see in the center here, is woodcut prints layer and distorting imagery of historical events in Central America. The Sandinista Revolution, the Civil War in El Salvador, the movement of guerrilla women. Shrouding these prints are color combinations of cotton cloths that carry propaganda and spiritual significance at the scale of a physical human body. Peace Through Understanding and Insurgently Sympathizing Peasant are sculptures installed throughout the Queens Museum's World's Fair cases that draw attention to the tragic events in Central America near or during the times of the 1964 and 1934 World's Fair. The form and meaning of these abstract sculptures contrast with the optimistic notions of progress and international relations promoted by the fairs. Taking the title of the 1964 World Fair, Peace Through Understanding resembles a fascist symbol to recall the dictatorships in Central America at the time, which were precursor to the civil wars of the 80s. In the 1939 section of the World Fair, Insurgently Sympathizing Peasant refers to the 1932 Salvadoran massacre known as La Matanza, in which a mostly indigenous peasant-led rebellion was suppressed by the government, with an estimated 25,000 deaths. Lava rock symbolizes devastation and loss within the work. This shot here is a two-person exhibition that I had at Radiator Gallery called To Look at the Sea is to Become What One Is, where I composed images that juxtapose fragility with solidity, using fresco painting, a process that infuses watered pigment into fresh plaster and is one of the most permanent painting techniques in history. I created fresco monochromes upon which I overlaid fragile, cold, figurative images to speak to the duality of permanence and impermanence. These figurative images recall the Salvadoran Monument to Freedom, Francisco Zuniga's 1956 stone sculpture, which represents the longings of the Salvadoran people. My triptych Trac Trac Trac, as you see here, depicts the bare feet of the sculpture in marching pattern as an homage to social democratic reform. The remaining frescoes act as spatial coordinates, installed to position the viewer's gaze toward the height of the monument as one would see it on its physical site. To look up and see bare life is to look at the height of the memorial, while gazing at its base is to experience caminantes at eye level. The volume of the gallery is a metaphorical placeholder for the allegorical sculpture, looking past gallery walls to a site far away. Echoing this longing, this is a piece called Home, which is a part of an extensive series of sculptures made at the scale of the human heart to carry when unwantedly uprooted. Through modular carpentry, I create personal altars that hold plants and flowers to reconcile what is lost and affirm new horizons. And I usually have poems tied to a body of work. And this is a poem that I wrote in reference to those pieces. Displaced hopes recover, resilience, labor of love, clenched fist, hearts greet us. I thought that would be a good way to kind of contextualize the way I manipulate material and the role of printmaking in my practice. Let's see, stop sharing. Apologies for that. And I work very modularly, combining various techniques, whether it's carpentry, fresco, or printmaking. And in that spirit, I thought that I would create a demo that exposes you to 4 or 5 different techniques that when used together can create very complicated and complex images. And hopefully with the intention of perhaps using materials that are found at home. So if y'all could cue the demo there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, thank you for joining me today. Today we'll be entering the world of printmaking. I'll be sharing 5 techniques that are non-toxic and can be done at home. Very easy to use to reproduce images, especially multiples, so you can share with friends and family. Printmaking is an artistic process where you create an image on a substrate or matrix and transfer that image onto a piece of paper or fabric. The first one, I will start with rubbing. Rubbing, for this one you'll need, I'm using computer sheets of paper, and I figured I'll start with, I'm working on a wood block at the time, carving it out actually, and see what texture it creates. Most important ingredient is the wax crayon. I'm using a crayon that's specifically used to rub tombstones, a lot of architectural surfaces like gates. I encourage you to look up the history of rubbings. Crayons, right? And so I just peeled off the sheet of paper, and that covers the crayon. And pressure is up to you, right? You can go light or heavy. And it's a very fun way, especially if you have a lot of crayons with multiple colors, to create images. And sometimes I use rubbings in order to see the stage of my woodcut at the time. Run around the house to look at different surfaces that could create interesting images. I found one with a wooden surface, straw, and metal. I usually hold the sheet of paper onto the surface of the object I'm rubbing to prevent any shifting. Gonna go ahead and combine this image with this one. In some objects you can already anticipate what type of imagery is going to come out, but if they're very textured as far as the face of the surface that you're rubbing, it can reveal interesting information that can't be seen to the naked eye. Actually, back in the day, when they made rubbings of stone sculptures, you could say it was an ancient way of scanning an object, and it would reveal a lot of hidden pieces of information. And so rubbings is a good way to collect semi-flat surfaces with textures in order to create fun images. And if you could see, it starts to show the grain of the wood. So I encourage you to go see what you can find at home. And taking the simple act of your drawing material of a crayon and a computer sheet of paper and rubbing surfaces and create fun and interesting compositions. Monotype. So for this part of the demo, if you have a baking pan or a styrofoam plate or plexiglass, it's a good surface in order to ink up and create an image. If you don't have any of those ready at hand, maybe a Ziploc bag. I think the key point here is that your surface is non-absorbent, and where you're able to kind of spread paint or ink around and not dry completely, not absorb to the surface. So I'm going to go ahead and, in the spirit of perhaps using materials found at home, I'm going to use a Ziploc bag as my surface for Monotype. Monotype is a unique image printed from a polished plate, metal, plexiglass, and there's so many things that you can do with Monotype, and I'll just share but a few. But through experimentation, the process itself kind of reveals, kind of whispers, winks at you what the next move could be. For this, if you don't have a brayer in order to distribute the ink, you can use a brush. I'll be using a brayer, and I'm using relief ink, a black, but you could use finger paint, tempera paint, acrylic. It doesn't have to be the relief ink. And so you could see the amount of ink that I'm putting. I would start with a minimal amount and build up as far as value or intensity of paint. And I'm distributing the ink throughout the surface of my palette / printing plate. And if you're using a brayer, you always want to lift after the initial spread of the ink. So each time you hear me touching the surface of the table, that's me lifting and going back down to evenly distribute the ink. It's up to you if you're a very messy artista. How much ink? I recommend a thin film of information and then start building your value. If you have too much ink, it has body, the ink has body, and so when you apply pressure to the back of your piece of paper, your print, it kind of splooges, it creates a kind of blobby texture. And so I went ahead and distributed my ink, and just with the back of my paintbrush, I'm gonna go ahead and draw. Very sharp lines. You could use a pencil as well. Even if you want some texture, you can get the bristle and get these wispy marks in there. You can crumple up paper in order to create texture. And even tear out some sheets of paper and block out ink here and see what can come out as far as an image. Use a computer paper face down. I try to center it, try to visualize that it's in the center, and rub with your hand. And so though it's light, I started light purposely. I can just already tell I want more ink. For instance, I want a darker image, but you could see the marks that I made, pencil marks, the brush marks in the center, the texture with the paper towel, and the block out in the bottom there where I'm blocking out. Another cool thing about Monotype is that you can print. There's still information here, and so you can go ahead and pull a print on that, what's left over, which is called the ghost image. And this perhaps requires a little bit more pressure since it's a light, there's less ink. Very, very light. And create one final print using this technique, which is called Monotype. And as you can see, you can go dark. Cool. So I'm gonna go ahead and set this aside for a moment. Stencils. And so for stencils, in the visual arts, right, the techniques for reproducing designs by passing ink or paint over a hole around in a carton or cardboard. And so stencils is a fun process that a lot of graffiti or street artists like to use. It's a very fast way to put up an image with spray paint, very graphic image. And so what I do is I go around the house and find soda boxes, pasta boxes, cereal boxes, and that has a carton that has a little bit of resistance to the to water. It doesn't fully absorb. And so just a very fun, quick exercise. is folding your carton in half and cutting shapes into it. Triangles, strips of little rectangles. Maybe you can shape it into a circle. If you're working with children with younger age, please supervise or cut them for it. Cut the stencils for them, right? Once you start to understand this process and you have a higher skill set, then you can use X-Acto knives and carve out shapes over a cutting board. But this is a quick way to create patterns. And so with my palette, the excess ink, I'm going to get a little bit of water to reactivate my palette here. And I'll have a little bit of, I'll have a paper towel to absorb the excess ink or paint. And I want to kind of, not too wet of a brush, but dry brush my paint over the stencil. I'm holding down the stencil with my non-painting hand. Make sure it doesn't shift, lift. You'll find your Goldilocks zone, what you're most comfortable with as far as how wet you want your paint. If you use too much water, it'll tend to go underneath the stencil and not make as a sharp edge or clean line on your design. But with practice, you can master these techniques through repetition. And you can see the painterly strokes there. And for relief, I'm going to use cardboard as my substrate, as the rigid surface, in order to glue a piece of foam paper. There's two types of foam paper. One that doesn't have an adhesive backing. You could still use this, but needs a little bit more prep time. So you have to glue it onto the surface, right? I have both, but I'm gonna go ahead and use a foam paper that has an adhesive backing. And so I'm gonna go ahead, you can pre-draw a design in anticipation for the demo. I went ahead and did a little sketch in order to create a design. You don't necessarily have to cut out in a regular shape as I am here. It could just be the straight up square sheet and gluing it onto the surface here. I usually glue my foam paper with Elmer's glue. This is up to, what type of skill set you have. Again, you can use an X-Acto knife to make really sharp on a cutting board or cutting mat to get very detailed images or shapes. But I'm also using, let's see, a pen. Ballpoint pen are really good for this process. It doesn't have a sharp edge to puncture, and it kind of rolls onto the surface, but also uniballs will work. You're making an impression. You're not carving out materials to create an image, you're pushing down the material. And in wherever you push down is gonna create an image. Here. And wherever I'm pushing down is going to come out white, or show the color of the paper that I'm printing on. Okay. And same process as I did with my Monotype. I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of ink to my palette. With my brayer, evenly distribute. And with the colored foam paper, it's kind of cool in the sense that you could see if you need more ink or not. I'm inking up here because it's colored. Where there's not enough ink, you can see the color come through, which tells you to add more ink if you want a darker image. But like I said, this kind of comes down to your aesthetic taste, your design, and I'm going to just center it for sake of clarity, and I'm rubbing, holding in place with my other hand so it doesn't shift around. And so this is a relief made out of foam paper and cardboard relief ink. But again, if you don't have a brayer or relief ink, you can use a brush and paint the surface here. And for the collagraph, I'm going to use foam paper, wood. Something I found is just a shelf liner here. Cardboard for my matrix. And Elmer's glue. Elmer's glue is the colla basically is glue and graph is to draw. Combine those two. You can make an entire collagraph just with glue itself. It's kind of draw with glue. I'm using Elmer's glue. Let that dry completely and ink that surface up and print it. And so yeah, it could be that you're drawing with the idea that the glue has a little bit of body to it, so it can catch ink. If when you're applying different textures, I would look for like semi-flat material that has a little bit of texture, leaves, feathers. I even see like embroidery fabrics that are being tossed around. Anything that you think that like no one would hurt from losing, I'd throw in there. And so I use a brush to not get so dirty on my hands. And I'm gluing the backside of whatever material that I want to create, that I want to add onto the surface. This is very spongy shelf liner. I'm going to go ahead and do that there. It's a pretty straightforward process as far as like application. It's kind of creating a collage with glue, however, with the idea that it has texture and it's going to pick up ink in order to be transferred. And I'm just showing you how I'm applying the glue onto the back of each material. It could be the material itself, or I go straight onto my cardboard. To glue. If I want to go ahead and glue smaller pieces like beans or rice, your glue needs to have a little bit of body so it can like sit in. And so, I don't know if you could see that. Right here. And so my glue has a lot of body to it. So the rice or whatever small particulars kind of set into the glue. Walk away from it. Depending on the thickness of the Elmer's glue, it could take 35 minutes, 15 to 45 minutes to dry. You know it's dry when it's completely see-through, when it's clear, your Elmer's glue. I've created an image beforehand. I went ahead and glued fabric, wood, cardboard, the shelf liner. I have some rice here. I like to do something also of gluing cardboard on there. And what I do is I get a piece of cardboard and I just peel back the top layer of it. And when you do that, it reveals a texture underneath the corrugation. You can glue cardboard on there and peel off the top skin of it to reveal the corrugation for texture. And that's another surface that creates information. And so once I'm happy with my design, and they're all glued down and it's dry, you can reintroduce ink here. And then just start inking the surface here. This process also you can use a brush in order to ink up your plate. And sometimes you might have to do that anyways, a combination of a brayer and a brush, because all the materials have different heights. And so that's the case for me. The height of the cardboard is different from the wood, different from the rice and the fabric. So I'll come in and paint where I don't see information. No paint on it. So I'm going to paint a little bit on the rice. See how that comes out. Paint my wood. Let's see what we have here. Okay. Trying to center it, holding it with one hand, and then an overall rub over the entire surface. Sometimes when you do that, the ink itself is tacky and it grabs your paper, and so it prevents shifting of the image. It's a little light. But yeah, you could see the wood, the shelf liner, the cardboard, the rice. The fabric is not coming out as much. And so I'm going to try this one more time. And so a print. The rice is starting to look like grass. The stripes, somewhat of a landscape, maybe a flag. But I encourage you to create multiple plates and see the different weird information that comes out. And again, once you start to get involved, the process itself starts to inform you what to do next. Oh, add more ink or add more texture here. It's too shallow. This was my first try. And so already I can tell myself to maybe add more body to my fabric, maybe add more rice. But I like this as a stage to start and perhaps, for instance, combine printmaking techniques. So I can come in and ink up my relief. And then maybe, oh, it's a little lonely up here. Okay. Well, I can come in and having the image face up, give it a little sun in the background. And so I got my relief, my collagraph, a rubbing with the stencil. Add a little bit of information at the bottom here. And so made a combination print with relief, collagraph, rubbing, and stencils. It's kind of actually one of my favorite parts is reading a print and trying to figure out the different processes that are happening. It's almost like reading a book and trying to figure out how the artist created the image. So I hope you had fun and you learned some stuff. I encourage you to go and find out like the cool stuff that is kind of in the closet as far as like cardboard and cartons and different materials that are usually tossed away, and see what kind of images you create. But thank you for joining me, and happy printing.
Okay, hope you all enjoyed that presentation. Thank you so much, Oscar, for putting that together. So let's get into it. Let's talk about your practice. You talk a lot about process and practice here, and I want to ask you just what that means to you and what the value of that is. Anything in your own words.
Yeah, I think that was one of the first ways that I got really involved in printmaking. I saw the connection of the process of carving and working with wood was it shared an affinity or a spirit of being on the construction site with my dad, working with wood. And so already like slowing down and kind of collecting my thoughts and getting lost in the process itself became kind of a meditative process. And eventually that became metaphor for how to make points or share a story, especially when it comes to working in the village, teaching workshops and trying to find using labor as a point of connection to talk about things you care about, and the role of hard work, right? That was something very hard growing up as a young artist and not having the culture that might support type of creativity that doesn't have an immediate monetary reward. And so process became a place of slowing down and reflecting and finding connections.
Okay, yeah, thanks so much. I mean, it's such an important thing to have some value to that. And I'm wondering how you incorporate cultural values, if any, into that.
That one's kind of, now it's becoming obsessive, where
Mm.
things are taking too long. But I think, yeah, the role of labor and not shying away of hard work to arrive at images that speak to you. Um, and it's almost a labor of love. A lot of the things that I do require a lot of time and prep. Um, and again, it goes back to in construction is kind of there's so many trades that goes into, for instance, creating a house. Like people pouring the foundation and putting up the carpentry and the studs and the walls and then the skinning and electricity and all that. All this stuff that go in to kind of create this one object, which is a house. Um, and so I tended to do things that required a lot of effort and work and shared a relationship to technique and craftsmanship. I'm still a little sloppy and wonky and weird. Um, but I gotta say that I guess the work ethic, working with my mom, cleaning houses when I was young, and then like kind of graduating into the construction side, work seemed to be like part of our existence. And so I kind of translated that and embodied it in the studio. Just
Great.
a labor of love.
Labor of love. Yes, definitely. Um, how do you how do you think about that in terms of like values of community? I know you talked a little bit about labor, of course, but I'm thinking specifically about Lower East Side community. You're a teacher at Cooper Union. I wonder if you have any thoughts on community in that sense, since we are a community organization.
Yes, yes. Well, I started, I guess, within my education. Um, there was a disconnect between how things were received in a critique setting, in a kind of in a gallery setting, and being away from maybe uh, the point of like the subject matter or the narratives that I was addressing. Um, and though I did have the community of artists, which was very important, um, I found that I had to get really close to where my parents came from, where I'm kind of a product of. And I naturally went to the site, which is El Salvador itself, which initially started as research in books. I needed to ground it to the physical experience it. And so there was a shift from research in books to applying big theories and ideas of what is needed in a community and trying them out, trial and error. And so there was this, I enjoyed this kind of working with the community itself. I enjoyed the vulnerability of learning things together and figuring things out. Um, and maybe bring down to reality things that are too big or too idealistic to do, putting in the work and effort and growing together. And so working with the community became a way to ground my work that felt alienated or far away. And so working with people is a huge part of having a dialogue that I feel that artwork creates a space for. Um, and eventually I evolved, not evolved, actually, like violence kind of pushed me out for a minute and started working in museums and now in the university level with that same intention of creating spheres of influence, kind of not symbolically addressing things, but embodying some of the values that we carry in community and bring it into the classroom and bringing it like cultivating that energy with the relationships that we build between students and professors.
Right. Yeah. So I think we can all relate to some of those experiences. I want to ask a few questions from the YouTube. I don't have any more myself right now. We do have about 15 minutes left, 10 minutes actually. So I can use that time to ask a few of these questions. So somebody asked if the foam was used in the demo, was that store-bought or was that found?
Store-bought. I also have a parrot at home, and I buy a bunch of little things to create toys for my parrot, and they sell that. to tear apart. But they also said in I think Michael's, Joann's, like arts and crafts stores. I've even seen it in 99-cent stores and bodegas. Dick Blick for sure sells them. But if you Google foam paper, there's the two kinds that doesn't have an adhesive where you have to glue it, and then the other kind which acts like a sticker and is much easier to work with. I think you can get like a pack of 25 for like $5 or $3. That might
Nice.
be even expensive. I think it's cheaper than that.
I'm hoping some people who are watching bought or got some of these materials or found some things at home, like Oscar always suggests. So
I've even seen like high profile print shops that are using foam, that type of foam, to kind of
right.
laser etch information that creates very fine detail. And it's so nice to see something that's humble
Yeah,
work in a professional setting.
right. I think a lot of people ask, like, because there's so much trash in New York, maybe you found these pieces somewhere. I've seen things like that. I actually did a project where I took foam that washed up on the shore from the East River and used that looked like rocks. So
Yeah.
have one more question here. Somebody's wondering why you paint stencil rather than stipple.
Stipple's completely fine. You can go ahead and stipple with your brush. I guess it's like a sensitivity of the hand. You know, that's where it comes into, is like being comfortable in how you apply information and how the material operates. But yeah, stippling can work. Even dabbing sponges, spray paint. Of course, you'll need to be in a ventilated area. But there's so many ways to basically, uh, push the ink through the hole in the carton. It doesn't have to be the brush.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Sounds great. Oh, so this was actually a question that I wanted to ask before. We talk a lot about art and activism here, and we're in basically the intersection of art and activism at our organization. And so I just want to hear you speak more about that, or I had that question here. So
Yeah.
I want to hear a little bit more about that.
I think it's extremely important to be, especially at times now when things can feel polarized, to create spaces like Loisaida and Clemente and even ABC No Rio, even Cooper Union itself. I think, even though it was a philanthropist, did start with humble beginnings. And these humble beginnings become decentralizations of power. And I think that, there are things that happen within your organizations that are so particular to the culture of the place that will maybe get lost in a kind of more streamlined or kind of behemoth of a university. And everything that I learned that I had to use as an experience to put on my resume or even get jobs were kind of cultivated by figuring out who I was in relationship to the community, especially if I'm like making work within that community. And activism is a very strong word. I would even feel that hesitant to use that word personally, because seeing like the activists out there and putting the amount of work and effort and hours to create things and affect policy is just it's intimidating. And so I think initially it was inspired by activism, working with the community, but then hugged in towards cultural development. And maybe we don't have the answers when we kind of are engaging in dialogue within these spaces, but we can create the conditions to arrive at answers through dialogue and cultivating a patience with each other. Because even within communities themselves, there could be a rift. And those are things that I came across working down in El Salvador, having huge, big ideas of uniting people, and then just coming across conflict within the small village and how polarized it could be. And so trying to close the gap and create a nuance in a gray area in a very kind of black and white discourse that, as we experienced with the Capitol riots, it's very alive.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're definitely seeing a lot of polar opposites happening nowadays.
Yeah.
So got one more question here, maybe a couple more. We have a question about technique. So applying ink to textured surfaces and then printing versus pouncing textured surfaces into palette, then printing. I'm not sure if I'm understanding this
Applying
question.
ink to textured surface, then printing versus pouncing textured surface into palette, then printing.
That doesn't seem like much of a question to me, but
Maybe it's an observation.
yeah, right. Somebody's might be asking just like, yeah, is that like a good technique? And
It is, and a lot of these things are evolutions of very. I usually have another presentation which talks about the evolution of the surface. You know, like the first marks in a cave is an index print, and then you blow, powder pigment on it and creates a stencil. Inadvertently scratching into cave drawings to create a relief, which become petroglyphs. And then stamps, and then that evolution. And so eventually you fast forward to like even frescoes, pouncing to kind of transfer an image to a plaster wall shares a close relationship to printing. It's basically poking a bunch of holes through a piece of paper and then pushing powder through it to create an image. So
Nice.
pouncing definitely overlaps, which is usually associated to fresco and painting. But there's so many ways in doing it. It's actually through experimentation and trial and error where new techniques arise.
Yeah, definitely. So we have one more question. We have a question from Alejandro, and this might be the last one. It's almost 7:30. This is a good one. Have you ever felt held back by controversial topics?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, constantly. Every summer was a new challenge. Whether we were stealing souls in pinhole camera workshops or indoctrinating the youth by just sharing techniques, and the youth sharing stories through those techniques, sometimes you're associated to this conflict. But that's why it's very important, for instance, Loisaida, is that when those flags do come up, or those points of contention, there's enough of a kind of, because it created a situation like that, like a community center, then that means that there's an opportunity to kind of mature and evolve maybe a very dense polarized politic or topics to address. They're not easy. And that's why they want the simple fix that usually violence follows through. And I think that the more that we can have spaces like Loisaida that creates those moments, even though they can be awkward, it's through dialogue that we can and communication that we can hopefully get past through differences.
Right. And want to make the correction. That question is actually from Phyllis through YouTube. So thank you, Phyllis. Great. So it's 7:30. Thank you so much for taking the time, Oscar. I just wanted to say a few more things about, yeah, of course. And just thank you again to the Whitney so much for having this event with us. We put in a lot of work, and the Whitney, thank you to Sophia and Daima specifically, and Lons. They're all big help. Sorry, Sophia, Silva, and Daima. I'm forgetting Daima's last name. But yes, so I wanted to talk about their shows that they have. Nothing So Humble. Nothing Can Be So Humble is going to be opened for until the end of February, I believe. And also, and Nothing Is So Humble is a show about, sorry, I keep saying the name wrong. Nothing Can Be So Humble is a show about printmaking. Oscar, none of your work is in it, I don't think, but we used that printmaking picture for the intro to the show, the banner. So yeah, so that's a great place to do that. Yeah, so thank you so much, Oscar, for presenting your work. And I really appreciate it. And I hope you guys will tune in and I hope you will see some of the shows at the Whitney. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.